Welcome back to M&A Corner. I'm delighted to be joined by Igor Kirman, a friend, but also a very prominent corporate attorney with the firm Wachtell Lipton. He's also an author and a professor of law as well. So he's a very busy man, but he took a little bit of time for us today so we could talk about the market environment and trends generally. Igor, pleased to have you here.
Well, thank you, Kevin.
So we've just gone through an election cycle, and there's going to be changes, and clearly the market had a reaction that was positive on the news. And in particular around M&A, people are talking about this being an accelerant of activity as we move into 2025. But before we get into future casting, how has the environment been over the last, call it 2 or 3 years? It's obviously been a more challenged environment. And I'm curious what you put your finger on in terms of the driver of the deceleration of activity, because I think it gives us perspective in how it might rebound in the future.
Look, it's a good question. Much better looking backwards than forwards. I think if you go back 3 years, as you just did, you're going back to 2021, which was unexpectedly, I would say, I'm humble enough to say unexpectedly, 2021 turned out to be a record-setting year that in the middle of COVID that nobody saw coming. It started at the end of 2020, frankly. I don't think I've ever worked as hard in my life as I worked in the year 2021, and the same across my entire firm, across the industry as a whole.
Almost amazingly, because you were probably doing it from your home.
Yeah, at home.
Which you never would have thought when you began your legal career you'd be able to actually function outside of an office.
I didn't know there were that many hours that you could work and that many meals you could skip. So I think 2021 was just the bazooka of a year. And I think, by many accounts, as may fall more in your expertise than mine, I think when you saw in 22 and then again in 23, to me the decelerant was really what was going on in the economy, the combination of inflation followed by interest rate increases and expectation that there would be more, and this fear of what kind of landing would we have to battle this inflationary situation. And I think, things fell back down in a very sharp way in 22 and continued also in 23. I mean, there's been a bit of a rebound in 24, a modest rebound. But I will say, since you've already raised future casting, that the prediction business has been alive and well every one of those years, always, by the way, pointing in the same direction.
I will say there was a bit of artificiality, it felt like, around 2021, and a good example of that is the SPAC boom, which has since come crashing down to earth. And certainly the interest rate environment was, if you think about a long-term perspective, fairly unsustainable and a bit outside the bounds of what a normal rate environment would look like. I do think we're moving into hopefully a situation where we can moderate those interest rate levels. Some of that inflationary impact starts to come away. When you think about the regulatory environment, I mean, I certainly saw deals that made their way to the boardroom at a conceptual stage, where even if people thought the analysis and believed the analysis would allow a transaction to go through Washington successfully, people were not interested in the fight. They weren't interested in the spotlight, and they didn't want to take 2 years out of the corporate history to try to get that transaction done. And so a lot of things never really got off the ground because of that. I'm sure you saw something similar from your side of the table.
Very much so, yeah. In terms of inhibitors for deal activity in the last couple of years, I mean, there's no question the regulatory environment played a role. It was not the only role. I do think the general economic issues, including most notably the interest rate environment, was a big deal. When you have private equity as big a player as it has become with that much dry powder, that whatever makes it harder for them to do deals will show up in the numbers. But in the boardroom, because he talked about that, I mean, I saw several flavors of what you're talking about. I'll give you one that